I left California to open Danny's paint shop, and that's where I've been ever since.
People have their whole worlds on the internet, and thank the Lord above that some of my life is secret anyway. But
for years, fans of Counting Cars accused the wrong man of stealing from Danny Koker's shop, while the real thief walked free with barely a headline. Meanwhile, the crew everyone assumed had scattered was doing something nobody expected, who actually stayed loyal to Danny Koker after the cameras left, and who vanished without a single explanation. Join us as we uncover what really happened to Danny Koker's crew after Counting Cars. Ryan Evans.
I was just gonna say, Mike, it's so nice to see you hard at work, man. Don't bust out a sweat over there, brother. Man!
In 2016, a headline about missing company funds started circulating online, and within days, one face kept showing up next to it that had nothing to do with the crime. Ryan Evans, the laid-back painter who had spent nearly 2 decades bent over Count's Customs spray booth, turning wrecked hoods into rolling art, watched his name get dragged into a scandal he had no part of. It happened the way most internet mix-ups happen, lazily. The man actually accused of raiding Count's Customs bank account wasn't a mechanic, a painter, or anyone who had ever appeared in a single episode. His name was Joseph Frontiera, and he worked in a back office most viewers never saw, handling invoices and payroll while the cameras stayed pointed at engines and chrome. But Ryan was one of the most recognizable faces from the show, a guy fans had watched on their screens for a decade. Joseph wasn't. So when people went looking for someone to blame, they reached for the face they already knew instead of the name they'd never seen. Joseph had joined the shop years earlier through a staffing agency, hired to keep the books balanced while Danny Koker chased down classic cars, and Ryan chased down the perfect paint match. Nobody suspected him of anything. He kept a low profile, which, it turned out, was exactly the problem. Nobody was watching closely enough to notice what he was doing with the company's money. Ryan never worked in the accounting office. He never touched payroll. He spent those years exactly where he always had, hunched over a paint gun, completely unaware that somewhere online, strangers had cast him as the villain of a story he wasn't even in. He never addressed it on camera, and the confusion simply faded the way most internet rumors eventually do. Not because it was corrected, but because people got bored and moved on to the next headline. What never faded, though, was the real story underneath it. Because while Ryan spent those years mixing custom colors in blissful ignorance, the man who actually did steal from Count's Customs was about to find out that Danny doesn't let things go quietly. Joseph Frontiera. By 2016, Danny's accountants noticed the math wasn't adding up, and what they found in the company's lawsuit stopped them cold. According to the filing, more than $75,000 had disappeared from Count's Customs over several years, funneled into personal expenses that had nothing to do with car parts or shop supplies. Some paid for airline tickets. A chunk went toward a Range Rover Joseph had no business affording on his salary. And somewhere along the way, the IRS came knocking too, slapping the company with an $18,000 penalty for taxes that were never properly filed. The lawsuit alleged something stranger still. Checks had been authorized using signature stamps that closely resembled the real signatures of Danny and his business manager, Kevin Mack, stamps neither of them remembered approving. It meant the theft wasn't a single slip-up. It was methodical, repeated, and hidden in plain sight inside the office responsible for keeping the shop financially afloat. Danny didn't stay quiet about it. Count's Customs filed a lawsuit against Joseph, laying out years of misused funds, forged authorizations, and a tax mess the company was left to untangle alone. Joseph pushed back and denied the accusations, and the case dragged through Nevada courts for years, buried in motions most fans never heard about because the show had already moved on to a new season. For Kevin, finding out someone had used a stamp of his own signature to move company money was its own kind of gut punch. His name used against the very shop he'd spent years protecting. Then, in 2019, it ended, with what's known as a stipulated judgment, both sides reaching an agreement outside a courtroom, without a trial ever deciding who was right. A separate criminal matter tied to the case closed around the same time, resolved with time already served. Joseph disappeared from public life almost entirely after that, scrubbed from the show's official cast records. As far as anyone can tell, he simply chose to vanish. The same year the case that defined his brief brush with fame closed its final page. For Danny, the damage lingered longer than the lawsuit did. He'd built Count's Customs on a simple promise that the people inside those garage doors were family. Now he knew that promise could be broken from the inside by someone nobody was watching closely enough. And somewhere else in that same shop, another crew member's exit would prove that not every disappearing act came with a scandal attached. Roli Szabo.
What are you doing, Roli?
Just got me a new toy.
You just got a new toy?
Yes.
What is it?
This is a Hayabusa.
Roli Szabo showed up in the very first episode of Counting Cars, and for 6 seasons, he was one of the most recognizable faces in the shop. Not because he built engines or laid down paint, but because nobody could resist his accent, his humor, and the meticulous way he brought a car back to a mirror, shine before an owner ever saw it. Long before he ever set foot in a Las Vegas garage, Roli's path to America ran through a traveling circus. In 1997, he came over on a work visa with Ringling Brothers and Barnum and Bailey, hired as bodyguard, driver, and personal assistant to a Hungarian performer billed as the smallest man in the world. He spent 2 years on the road before settling in Las Vegas in 2005, years before Counting Cars existed, a man who'd already lived one unbelievable chapter before viewers ever met him. Then, after season 6, he was just gone, and longtime fans were left scrolling back through old episodes wondering what they'd missed. Some believed he'd been let go without warning. Others assumed he simply got tired of the cameras. When one fan finally pressed him about it on social media, Roli's answer explained almost nothing, only that it was complicated, and that whether he'd ever come back wasn't entirely his call to make. What sat behind that vague answer turned out to be worse than office politics. Around the same period, Roli's trailer, packed with detailing equipment he'd invested years of savings into, disappeared from a parking lot in the middle of the night. Security footage showed someone hooking it up and driving off with a trailer that had Roli's own name and face painted across the side, a loss that cost him more than money. It cost momentum, client trust, and the ability to simply show up the next morning. Roli didn't disappear from the trade. He rebuilt, launching his own detailing company, chasing work across Las Vegas, and training as far as Quebec for a while, thriving on his own. But that momentum stalled again. His business website eventually went dark, replaced by a barely used YouTube channel. And whether the detailing business still operates today is genuinely unclear. What is clear is that the fast-talking detailer who made every car gleam like it just left the factory floor never really got a proper goodbye. He just stopped showing up, first on the show, then, it seemed, almost everywhere else. Not every crew member's exit stayed that murky, though. One of them left under rumors just as dark, and it took years before anyone bothered to check if those rumors were even true. Scott Jones.
I usually leave the technical stuff to them. Mainly what I do is this. Yo, Humberto, get out. Humberto been on that piece.
Scott Jones was the first man Danny trusted to run the business side of Count's Customs, long before Kevin Mack ever set foot in the shop. Scott managed the books, kept the crew in line, and appeared regularly through the show's first 2 seasons with a bluntness that made him one of the more memorable early personalities on the series. Then, heading into season 3, Scott simply wasn't there anymore, and the internet did what it always does with an unexplained absence at a shop still shaking off its own scandal. Rumors spread that Scott had been fired. Others guessed at some falling out behind the scenes, a betrayal fans imagined but never actually saw. For years, his name got tossed around in the same breath as the shop's later embezzlement scandal, even though the 2 stories had nothing to do with each other. The real reason was almost disappointingly ordinary compared to the rumors. Scott had recently become a father, and he made the decision to step away from the cameras and the long shop hours to raise his son somewhere quieter. He relocated to Tennessee, trading the neon glow of Las Vegas for a slower pace most viewers never got to see. The show briefly acknowledged it during the season 3 premiere, though the mention was so quick that most casual viewers missed it entirely and kept assuming the darker version of events instead. In fact, the real story was almost boring by comparison. A man who looked at his newborn son and decided reality television wasn't worth missing the early years for. Scott has kept a remarkably low profile ever since, reportedly running his own automotive shop somewhere in Tennessee, far from the spotlight that once put his name next to accusations he never actually earned. He doesn't court publicity, doesn't do interviews rehashing his counting cars days, and seems entirely content having traded fame for fatherhood. It's a strange thing, watching how differently 2 departures from the same shop got treated by the public. One man walked away to raise his kid and spent years fending off rumors he was never guilty of. Another man was genuinely guilty of exactly what people accused him of, and somehow generated less lasting outrage than the version of the story that wasn't even true. If Scott's story proves anything, it's that leaving Count's Customs was never actually a red flag, which makes what happened to the 2 men who never left at all even more remarkable, because staying, it turned out, came with its own kind of story worth telling. Ryan Evans and Kevin Mack. While Roli's chapter closed under a cloud and Scott's closed out of state, 2 men at Count's Customs simply never left. Their loyalty, one of the least talked about, most remarkable threads running through the entire show. Ryan first walked into the shop back in 1999, after moving from Texas to Los Angeles in 1996, chasing a career in custom car culture. Shannon A. Cow, the shop's motorcycle expert, spotted his work and personally recruited him to Las Vegas. What started as a painting job became a career-long partnership. 27 years later, Ryan is still there, still running the paint division, the guy Danny trusts to turn a beat-up hood into something worth showing off. He travels the car show circuit, appearing at events from Syracuse to Detroit, representing a shop that no longer needs a television deal to matter to him. Kevin's story runs almost as long, though it started differently. He met Danny more than 25 years ago, bonding over custom motorcycles long before either thought about starring in anything. He spent 15 years in the convention industry before officially joining Count's Customs in 2005, stepping into the manager role Scott left behind. Kevin became the person keeping the shop financially afloat, while Danny chased down classic cars for the cameras, and the person other crew members leaned on when personalities clashed. Kevin's own garage tells you more about him than any interview could. Parked among the show cars sits a 1969 Cadillac Sedan DeVille. He restored himself, built to match the exact car his grandmother used to drive. A private tribute inside a shop that spent 10 seasons chasing loud, flashy builds for total strangers. There was a stretch in 2020 when Kevin barely appeared on screen. And just like with Roli years earlier, fans assumed the worst, that he'd quit, been pushed out, or fallen out with Danny. None of it was true. Kevin simply preferred staying out of the spotlight, handling the parts of the business that never made good television. While cast members came and went, got tangled in rumors, or walked away under circumstances nobody bothered to explain, Ryan and Kevin simply kept showing up year after year, long after the show that made them recognizable had stopped airing new episodes. Loyalty like that doesn't trend online, but sitting next to 4 other stories of departure and disappearance, 27 years and 21 years start to look less like a footnote and more like the real heart of the shop. And not everyone who built something new after the show needed to stay inside Count's Customs to prove it mattered to them. Horny Mike, Shannon Aku, and Ghetto Bob. Mike Henry, better known as Horny Mike for sticking 3-dimensional horns onto absolutely everything he touched, spent years as the shop's resident airbrush artist and comic relief. Long after the cameras left, Mike turned that signature style into an independent brand, selling merchandise through his own website and staying visible enough online that he never really needed the show to stay relevant. He even turned up as an early guest on Danny's new podcast, proof that this shop never lost its sense of humor.
And Danny had approached the shop I was working at to build a custom motorcycle. Danny really loved the work that I did for him back then, and I've been with him ever since.
Shannon's proudest build was never anything flashy from the show. A 1977 Purple Haze chopper built around the last engine his father, Jimmy, ever finished. The same man who taught him everything about bikes and whose knowledge later helped him recruit Ryan into the shop in 1999. That bike hung above the bar at Count's Vamped for years, a piece of family history bolted to the wall of a rock club that closed its doors for good in 2025. Then there's Ghetto Bob, who didn't join the main cast until 2016. He took over as general manager of project production, handling everything from custom audio systems to full interior builds. Bob's own history with cars started decades earlier, installing audio systems as a teenager in Houston, then cutting his teeth as the original car audio guy at West Coast Customs. Of all the builds he worked on for the cameras, the one that meant the most was his own father's 1966 Mustang Fastback, restored for an audience that had no idea how personal that episode actually was. Bob became known for one meme-worthy moment on the show. Snapping at Mike with a catchphrase, the crew turned into a running joke, cementing himself as the character fans still quote years later. But maybe the clearest sign that Count's Customs was never just a workplace came from the crew member whose exit had looked saddest on paper. In October of 2025, years after Roli vanished under a cloud of stolen equipment and unanswered questions, he resurfaced at the Mariposa Car Show standing right next to Mike. The two of them clowning around for cameras like no time had passed at all. It wasn't the first time they'd found their way back to each other either. Friends online had spotted them together as far back as 2021. But the Mariposa reunion, 4 years later, was the one that finally answered the question fans had been asking since day one. Whatever happened behind Roli's exit, it clearly didn't end the friendship. And if the crew could hold on to that bond without any cameras watching, it raised one more question. How was the man who built the whole shop holding up, now that the cameras were gone for good? Danny Koker. While fans spent years piecing together what happened to his crew, Danny was fighting a stranger battle, convincing the internet he was still alive. At some point after the show stopped producing new episodes, Danny started making fewer public appearances, and his face, when it did show up online, looked noticeably thinner than the version fans remembered from a decade of television. Speculation filled the gap almost immediately. Some assumed he was seriously ill. The rumors escalated further when an old obituary for his own father started circulating out of context. stripped of the details that made clear whose death it was actually announcing. For a while, corners of the internet were convinced Danny had died, based on nothing more than a recycled obituary and a face that had lost some weight. Danny never addressed it directly, and strangely, he didn't need to. He kept showing up at car shows, working the shop floor at Count's Customs, still open 7 days a week for free public tours of the very collection that made the show worth watching in the first place. That workload finally caught up with him in 2025. For 16 years, Danny and his wife, Roli Koker, had run Count's Vamped, the rock bar and grill that became as much a part of his identity as the garage itself. In June of that year, they shut it down for good. They didn't let it go quietly. The final weeks turned into a proper send-off, with Night Ranger and Loverboy taking the stage before Danny's own band, Count's 77, closed things out to a sold-out room one last time. He didn't frame it as retirement. He called it club fatigue, the simple exhaustion of running a live music venue for nearly 2 decades on top of everything else carrying his name. Not long after, a for sale sign went up on a building that had hosted almost 2 decades of packed Friday nights. It turns out, the man who spent 10 seasons building custom cars for other people spent the years after the show rebuilding his own life instead, one closed chapter and one new project at a time. The crew scattered, regrouped, vanished, and resurfaced in ways nobody watching in 2012 could have predicted. And somehow, through all of it, the shop that started as one guy's hobby was still standing, still open, still run by the same man who never actually left. If loyalty like Ryan and Kevin's rarely gets the credit drama gets, are we better at remembering the people who caused chaos than the ones who just did their jobs for 2 decades? Share your thoughts with us in the comments section. Remember to like, share, and subscribe for more. Also, click the next video showing on your screen. You will enjoy it.